there is no final solution to how you should shape yourself to the environment or how you should shape the environment to you. There is no final way. I know this sounds paradoxical, but we always have to be perpetually hungry for insight and for that adaptive evolution of our cognitive fittedness to the environment.
I've heard you say that people often study what is most lacking in their lives. Is this true for you with regards to awakening from a meaning crisis?
Yeah, it is. That was when I was in grad school. I had a friend, and he said people went into psychology often to study what they were lacking. And so I study relevance and meaning, which and there's definitely existential truth. I'm very much about trying to understand how we are connected to ourselves, to each other, to the world, in ways that really matter to us and to others. And that's because I very much suffered my own personal version of a meaning crisis, and this task of sifting through all of the available information to find the relevant information has been something that I've needed to get better at in my own life. In some ways, I am I am the proverbial doctor trying to cure his own disease. Yes.
You professionalize the personal challenge. I mean, being honest from my side with this show as well, very much I took a big left turn just before I started it, and I needed to find answers. I didn't even know what the questions were, but I just wanted some sort of answers, and I think often you can actually end up bearing pretty good fruits from that. One of the things that I've been really interested in over the last couple of years has been evolutionary psychology, and yes. I find there to be an interesting intersection between your work and that. So given that we're biological creatures, why do we need meaning structures? Like, it seems like our default setting as humans is so far away from what's optimal for flourishing and pursuing wisdom and meaning and flow. Like, why do we have to do all this work? Like, is it just a mismatch with our genes being there to make us effective and not happy? Is it a weird quirk of having a phenomenological experience of being like a human? What's going on?
Well, there's a lot there. There's 2 points I'd want to pick up on. There's one is I think there's an implicit standard, and I don't mean this in any accusatory fashion, but I think there's an implicit standard behind your question that I'd like to explicate and perhaps challenge. And then we also face the issue that we are not just biological creatures; we're cultural creatures, and that has an important impact. But let's do the first one first. Why does meaning matter so much? Well, we really tried in psychology for 40 years to not deal with meaning. It was the behaviorist period, and we thought, no, what we could do is we could just look at observable behavior and the observable properties of the stimulus and just get those chains, and we had Watson and we had Skinner and we had literally 100,000 of hours on working with the rats, and it turned out it doesn't work, and that's why there was this thing in the 50s called the cognitive revolution, because by and large you don't respond to the physical properties of a stimulus. You respond to, well, I'll use it vaguely here and then we'll make it sharper as we go along. You respond to the meaning. So I can shout fire, which is an acoustic stimulus, and you'll run from the room. You can see yellow flame, totally different stimulus, and you'll run from the room. You can smell the smoke, totally different stimulus, and you run from the room. Why are all the behaviors the same, even though the stimuli are so different in their physical properties? Well, because they all mean the same thing to you. But here's the way to get at the meaning. They're all relevant to you in a particular way, right? Of all the information available to you, right? And this is what you have to get right from the beginning. There is an astronomically vast amount of information available to you at all time, both without in the environment and within your long-term memory. It's never full. You never go, nope, can't take any more in, right? And so you have a vast amount. And yet out of all of that, you have to do this coordinated search between these two and zero in on the relevant information. And what's happening, right, for you or even right, any other organism, when in all those instances of the fire is you're grasping the relevant information that you need in order to solve your problems. So you are framing the environment in a particular way. So when I say you're responding to the meaning, I don't want you to hear like semantic meaning. I don't want to, I'm not, that's only one species of what I'm talking about. We do use words to zero in on our attention, but way before, and all the other organisms don't use words, we had to develop the intelligent capacity to pay attention in the right way. And so that ability is fundamentally adaptive. And I don't mean just that it makes us more adaptable. What I mean is how it unfolds is in an adaptive process. So what I've proposed is, and this is following up on the work of Evan Thompson and work I've done with other people, that our ability to do that is deeply analogous to how evolution works. Evolution works by creating a large variation in the population, right? And then it puts selective pressure and it winnows it down, and then the variation comes out of that again, and it winnows it down, and you get, right, this feedback cycle of reproduction with change. I argue, in the theory that I've worked, and I'm talking about this at many levels, complex and recursive, so don't hear it overly simplistically. Your brain is doing the same thing. It's opening up attention for various possibilities. That's why you get distracted. But it's also slamming your attention in to try and select. That's why you can get fixated. And you're constantly trying to go between fixation and distraction, and it's your daily life. And you say, why can't I just get to the perfect place? Because there is no such thing. And that's the standard I want to challenge. Right? You can get an optimal grip. You can get an equilibrated state for right here, right now, in this environmental context. But all species go extinct. To pick up on the biological analogy, there is no final solution to how you should shape yourself to the environment or how you should shape the environment to you. There is no final way. So we have to, I know this sounds paradoxical, but we always have to be perpetually hungry for insight and for, right, that adaptive evolution of our cognitive fittedness to the environment. And so and one of the things I think we need to give up, and this is where I get into many arguments with a lot of people, we need to give up the idea of perfection as what we're seeking. That what we're trying to do is get to some final state where, like, why is it so difficult? Why can't I just get to the final state where everything works and I have that optimal fit? Well, you would have to be in an absolutely unchanging in all dimensions environment. And you know where you don't absolutely want to be? You don't want to be in that environment. So you're right. You're basically committed to the fact that relevance realization is an open-ended evolving process. And what I've been trying to do in some of my work, especially with the help of Chris Mastropietro, is to shift our sense of what is most meaningful, what I call sacredness, off of perfection and onto this ongoing evolution of your evolvability. So that's how I would answer the first part. The second part is, as I said, this isn't just going on biologically, right? Yeah, so biology has shaped me. So I'm a particular size. So notice my hand is shaped because parts of the environment are shaped so that I can actually pick up parts of those environment that are graspable to me and I can make tools, right? And so biology and evolution have shaped me. But you know what culture does? You know, culture teaches me how to use objects that it has shaped so we constantly fit together. But culture isn't standing still either. And then, as I just said, your own dynamic cognition is constantly doing that too. So I think when you put it that we're cultural beings, you have to see that we are this goes back to Plato. We are operating at, although it also in modern work by Christopher Honey, great neuroscientist, we're working at many different scales because adaptivity isn't a one-shot deal. There's what's adaptive now. There's what's adaptive, a little bit broader context, what's adaptive, right? And those are in trade-off relationships, right? So I'm wired to gorge on sugar and fat, and I eat the chocolate cake. But the problem is, in this environment, chocolate cake is too available. And so I better look for more long-term goals of health, right, et cetera. And so that fact that we exist at multiple levels, that we're cultural, and that our adaptivity is an unfinished, you can't finish it. This is not a finishable project. That's how I would suggest you have to reframe it.
I had this Alan Watts quote floating around in my head for years, and I can't get rid of it. It says, if we are unduly absorbed in improving our lives, we may forget altogether how to live them.
Yes.
And that process of being and becoming, the balance between being tough enough on yourself to motivate further action and delicate and compassionate enough on yourself to be able to have gratitude for the things that you have done. This to me seems like being comfortable with our sense of lacking wisdom for people who desire wisdom seems to be one of the most difficult things to bear, because it's both the poison and the tonic.
Yeah. Well, pharmacy, medicine means both poison and medicine, the Greek word. It means both. And Socrates talks about this in the Symposium, right? We are never wise. We are always lovers of wisdom. If someone says they're wise to you, that's often very good evidence that they aren't. So when you love something, love is this weird thing. Like, love is to recognize a lack, but also it starts to shape you in your seeking. And part of the trick of love, I think, is taking that lack and taking that gap, that hole, that opening, that vulnerability, and shaping it into receptivity, shaping it into sensitivity. Because you're never going to grasp wisdom, but you can progressively learn how to reshape your lack into a sensitive space that's better and better at receiving it. And so I think that the task of being a good philosopher, a lover of wisdom, is exactly to go through that transformation. And I think that's consonant with many of the ways we have to learn how to love. The difficult thing, and I find it personally difficult, I'm not speaking as somebody who's on the other side of this mountain. I'm still very much slogging in the foothills trying to make my way up. But getting from, love as not sort of trying to hold on, but hold up, right? And so that you can get into this reciprocal opening with something or someone. I think that's a big part of this. But that's what I was meaning when I was talking about an optimal grip. This is a term from Merleau-Ponty. Like, when you don't think of yourself when you're observing. Let's just do visual perception. You're not static. You move around. So what you do is you move closer to the object if you want more detail. You move farther out if you want the bigger picture. And there's no perfect place to be, because you're constantly adjusting that according to, the needs that you have that are changing and the environment that is constantly changing. In a similar way, if you'll allow me a bit of a stretch, you have to get an optimal grip on yourself, and you have to get an optimal grip on your lack of wisdom, so that you come, in some sense, to start to know yourself in the shaping of your love for wisdom.
Is that why you've got your tattoo?
Yeah. This one, you mean Know Thyself? Yeah. Yeah, the one on my back is because I want Socrates constantly behind me. Yeah. I mean, I keep coming back to that again and again and again. And how often, and I'm going through something around this right now, where I've found ways in which, unbeknownst to me, I have been inertial. I have not been knowing myself so that I can open up properly to the world. And so that keeps coming. And the Socratic sense of this, right? Know thyself isn't to recount your autobiography. We're all wonderful at that. And we glory in it. And how unique my autobiography is, and all that largely bullshitty thing we do. But more really, it's almost like I say, it's not an autobiography. I sometimes say it's more like an operating manual. Like, how do I function? How do I work? How am I stuck? How am I ignorant? And even more important, can I get some sense, often with the help of others, of how I'm self-deceptive? That's what it means to know yourself from the Socratic point of view.
If you were to write an IKEA manual, you've just mentioned the operating schedule there. And my first ever brief for the website that came attached with this podcast 3 years ago was, life doesn't come with an operating manual.
Yeah.
If you were to do that IKEA put it together book, what would the broad chapters be? What would it look like?
The broad chapters would be learning about the different ways in which we learn, the different ways we know. I mentioned the perspectival and the participatory, like the procedural and the propositional as well. So learning the ways in which we are intelligent learners, and then learning the ways in which the very use of that intelligence makes us vulnerable to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. And then learning how to cultivate an ecology of practices, multi-level, recursive self-organization, checks and balancing, an ecology of practices that can ameliorate the really, really complicated and often screwed up dynamical systems that we become. And then paying attention to the dimensionality of that this is not just a cognitive task. You're not just coming into a cognitive maturity. This is also, and these are interwoven. We separated them in our culture, but they're not separated in our brain. The way our, emotional maturity, what does cognitive maturity look like? What is emotional maturity? How do those two forms of maturity bump up against each other? How do they afford each other? How do they support each other? How do they interfere with each other? And also existential maturity, which has to do with, what kind of, I hesitate to use this word, but what kind of self do you have? We're talking about know thyself. What kind of self do you have? What kind of roles is it capable of? How well coordinated are those roles? How much do they conflict with each other? How are you getting an optimal grip between, this is from Vellman, being sort of like what he calls a wanton behavior, where you're just acting on impulse, or you're so up here, you're Hamlet, and you're reflecting yourself to death, and everybody's dying around you. What kind of, are you in between? Is yourself getting you in between those two? Is it helping you aspire to a better future self? Is it, like I said, allowing you to assume the roles that allow you not only to function in a socially or even morally acceptable way, but in a way that affords the making of meaning, the making of those real connections? So, yeah, I think those are the things I put in as the chapters.
I reckon you could construct a fairly good human from that. I reckon you could. Okay, so looking at the meaning crisis that we've got at the moment, I've spoken to a lot of people on the show about breakdowns of tradition and loss of faith in religion and all of the kind of obvious trope, the people getting married later, people starting the challenges of women having to actually make a choice between having a career and having a family now. That is a difficult decision for a woman to make. Yes. Moving forward, with regards to meaning right now, what's your sort of sense? Because I know that the circles that you speak to are very, very positive. The David Fullers of the world, the Jordan Halls of the world. Well, I mean, Jordan's not necessarily positive. He's sort of cataclysm side of stuff. But it's people who understand what's happening. It's people who have a sense of the direction that we need to go in. I've spent a lot of time dealing with 18 to 21-year-olds on the front door of nightclubs. I've watched a million of those people go in and out. They're fantastic people. They're wonderful. They don't seem to be contemplating a meaning crisis. How do we bridge a gap in a world of TikTok and booty pictures and funny cat videos of getting people to think about the thing which makes life worth living?
Okay, well, first of all, it sounds like you were in a different place, because I meet those 18 to 20-year-olds elsewhere, of course, because I'm a university professor. And the courses I teach that have to do with meaning and wisdom are overwhelmingly my most popular courses. And my colleague, Jordan Peterson, when he spoke about that, that's what helped rocket him to the position. So I think there's good evidence that there is hunger, and there's good evidence that there's suffering. Remember, if you don't properly cultivate the gap, it can run awry. We have, that group, even worldwide. It's ameliorated by contextual things. Some countries, often countries that are not as well off economically, and therefore tend to be more religious. But overall, that group is going through an increase in suicide, increased anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, increase of related phenomena, where for all of this connectivity, there's increased sense of loneliness, which is really paradoxical, given what we keep getting told by our culture. And you see a hunger for religious behavior in these people. They flock to superhero movies. They dress up in costumes. They play endless role-playing games. There's there's the virtual exodus, the escape into virtuality in one way or another to try and find. So yeah, they may not be explicitly saying, I'm suffering from a meaning crisis, but they're showing a lot of the signs that they are. And when you start to give them just the first preliminary vocabulary to start articulating it, this is what I've seen. They get very, very excited about it, and very like, oh, right. In fact, that was one of the most prevalent responses I got from people. I still continue to get is like both in my classes and in my series is you gave me vocabulary to talk about this stuff, right? And sorry, my phone thinks I'm trying to talk to it. Yeah, and so I mean, Chris Mastropietro and I we published an article in the Side View, the journal, where we basically laid out. I'm just giving you a snippet. There's a whole symptomology of stuff that's happening, positive stuff too. Right? There's positive signs. These people are way more interested in mindfulness. They're taking up an ancient philosophical practice, Stoicism. Stoicism is going through a boom right now, right? Because they're looking for ways to cultivate wisdom. And so, yeah, granted, I won't go into the history, but let me say there are perennial problems we face of self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. So we will perennially need ecologies and practices that help us deal with that. And our culture isn't offering wisdom cultivation and that's why people are so easily sucked in to conspirituality, as Jules Evans talks about it, right? Because they're looking for anything that will give them the discernment they're hungering for, will give them some sense of connection and self-transcendence. And so I do think that Jordan Hall is right, that we are going through a kind of complexification in our culture due to the technology and the communication and globalization that is just putting even more pressure on the perennial problems. It's like an accelerant on those problems that have made it very, very much more urgent for people. So, I mean, there's mounting evidence that Instagram and TikTok are really bad for your mental health, right? And it's interesting because my son is in that, well, he's just past that generation, my older son. My younger son is just coming into it. My older son is like 25, my younger son's 16, so they're bracketed around this group, and I see them wrestling with that a lot. That this stuff, it's simultaneously very salient, and at the same time, it's not satisfying.
We spoke about this before we started, that I wonder how much we can take of the good of social media, the things that you have enjoyed and relish and cherish, and the same for myself, without so much of the things which make us feel, even in the moment, not great, and afterwards, retrospectively, pretty terrible. And I've also read a lot of existential risk over the last couple of years, which sort of fascinates me and terrifies me in equal measure. And when I combine that, which is, I guess, civilization-wide, geologically wide, or interstellarly wide, with what's happening on an individual level, on a cultural level, locally, in terms of people not binding together. I don't know my next door neighbor's name. I don't know the person that lives next door to me. That wouldn't have happened. That wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. No. And is it a break point that's coming? Is it the sort of thing that's likely to require a big wall to hit, or is it the sort of thing that's going to slow down gradually?
Is civilization the kind of thing that's going to slow down gradually, or
this acceleration towards what could be some very, very maladaptive practices for humans, the way that we act, the way that we interact with each other, the things that we value?
Yeah. So when I was going to do Awakening for the Meaning Crisis, I mean, I was being encouraged by people. The videos here, a lot of people said, "There's no way people are going to sit through an hour and do 50 of those," and they were wrong. People did, and then communities grew up around it and continue. So, I mean, but on the other hand, to your point, I mean, I won't get like millions of views or something like that you might get for a cat video or something like that, right? So I get what you're saying, and I'm not trying to be dismissive. I do want to point out, though, that there is evidence that people are capable and they will seek out deeper, more long-term stuff, even in social media. And so that means there's at least a viable vehicle by means of which we might do what I've been suggesting, which I have this sort of slogan, and it's been put to music, where I talk about stealing the culture. I don't know. Jordan Hall and other people are better at sort of the economic, sociopolitical, environmental factors. I do know something about complex systems theory and the Bronze Age collapse of civilization. And there are things that are genuinely very worrying about what we're doing right now. So I think there are too many, how do I say this without sounding conspiratorial? There are too many bad faith actors in the social media world. And they're not even human beings. Many of them are just algorithms that like to manipulate us into a narrative mode, like to excite us into outrage, make us feel needy, make us feel insufficient, inadequate, because then they can sell us ideas and products and manipulate us. And we have increasing evidence that this is at work, and increasing evidence that what it does is it just takes those self-deceptive patterns within individuals, like individually, and then just accelerates them between individuals collectively, and then people internalize that, and you get all of this crazy stuff happening. And I'm not right wing or left wing on this, but I have no, I have no deep faith in the corporate machinery and corporate culture. There are individuals. I want to be clear about that. I've been approached by businesses. One person said this very well. He said, I'm not just in the bottom line. I'm here for the top line. I do want to make a profit, but I really believe in the meaning crisis, and I really want to try and bring what you have to say. So there are individuals. I don't want to deny or dismiss them, because they are. I meet a lot of them, but I think they are the exception that proves the rule. Right? That by and large, we are in a situation that's being accelerated by social media that is taking us further and further away from wisdom and starving us more and more for meaning. And so what I mean by steal the culture is this vehicle is viable the way the early small, and this is the only way, this is the only dimension along which I'm making the comparison, in which the early Christian communities took shape and started creating a different way in which people could be with each other, a different sense of what it was to be a self. I mean, Augustine invents the sense of self, the interior self that we now think is natural. Right? You can see Carey's book on it is beautiful, right? Just brilliantly argued. So the Christians are creating a new sense of self, a new sense of community, a new whole way of seeing and being, and they're doing it outside the huge manipulative machinery of the Roman Empire until eventually, right, as the Roman Empire starts to weaken, that culture takes over. The empire still falls, but that culture then goes on and becomes Christendom, which of course then had its own problems. And because again, there is no final state, there is no final solution. So I think the solution is to try and steal the culture, and that's a long-term intergenerational project, and that's where the work of Zach Stein about we've got to bring back education as a long-term intergenerational project, I think is really, really pertinent. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do something analogous and I don't mean to set myself up in any other way, but I'm trying to do something sort of analogous to St. Paul and to Augustine, because I don't think we can. So when I was growing up, and I'm old, maybe you guys still know it. There was a rock group called The Police. Sting came out of that, right? And they have Spirits in the Material World, which is a really Gnostic song. And they have the line in there is no political solution. And I know people get angry at me when I say this, but I don't think there is a political solution. I think what we need is a cultural solution, and that's much more difficult to generate. And I don't think the machinery of the state or the machinery of the market is going to be particularly helpful for that project.
I think I agree. I mentioned to you before we started that I often get drawn into conversations around politics and sort of collectivist stuff. Someone commented the other day saying that they couldn't work out my political standing, and I replied and just said, "Good." Like I don't want to be someone who leads with his groupthink ideology belief structure first. Getting back to the personal, getting back to the individual, relevance realization is a term that you've popularized.
Yep.
Can you take us through that and why it can cause us problems and also liberation?
Oh, well, I was mentioning it earlier, and so I was talking about this fact, that the brain is doing this process analogous to evolution, right? Where, remember the way your attention is widening out and getting distracted, introducing variation, right? And then it zeroes in. And then sometimes when you get sort of, you think you've got a problem framed, and then you realize, and you get an insight, you go, oh, right, I'm looking at it the exact wrong way. And here's where I want to say, I'm finding the wrong thing salient. I wasn't actually picking up on the relevant information. That's an insight. So this process is like evolution. It's self-organizing, self-correcting. Insight is your most common experience. When you chain a bunch of insights together, right, you get the flow experience, and people find that optimal. So as I said, and this is the core thing, the core difficulty facing us to try to make AI, right? Making an AI that can do great logic and math. We've been able to do that for decades. Getting an AI that can zero in on the relevant information to solve a problem at hand, that's the hard problem. It's often called the frame problem in artificial intelligence. And yet you're doing it right now. Think about how so much is obvious to you. And here's the thing you can rely on in your everyday life, things being obvious to you. But my job as a scientist is I can't rely on that. I have to try and explain how you do that. How is it that it's just obvious to you, right? That when I'm saying you know that I'm talking to you right now, but also you have a sense that it could apply to people in general, and you're following up on some implications and not others, and you're paying attention to everything I say, but not literally everything I say. Like, how you're doing all of that, and what associations you're calling to mind. Now, but the problem with that is that zeroing in. So this is not what you're doing. Your brain isn't checking all of the information to see if it's relevant. So no, because that would take the rest of the history of the universe. So this is like a Zen koan. Somehow you're intelligently ignoring most of the information, overwhelmingly most of this vast amount of information, and zeroing in. Now, you can't do it perfectly for reasons I've already discussed, but you're really, really good at it. But here's the thing. That focusing of your attention and ignoring information that makes you so adaptive also means your attention is biased, that you sometimes ignore things you shouldn't ignore. So I go into a place where, well, people used to do this, but then phones took this away, so this is now disappearing as a death ray. But until phones, this used to be a big deal. People would go into a dark place where they knew flammable gas was dispersed, and they needed light. So they would strike a match because they wanted light, and that's relevant. And they didn't pay attention to what they thought was an irrelevant side effect, because it normally is, which is the heat of the match. But in that situation, it turned out to be relevant, and they blow themselves up. So part of wisdom is learning how to improve that relevance realization so that it is better and better at being self-corrective, better at being insightful, so that when you have misframed things, because you always have to frame things. That's relevance realization. But wisdom is to enhance that so that you get better at being more insightful and cutting through ways in which you might be potentially misframing the situation.
Upon hearing your work, because I came to you after going through the rationalist movement, and I hear echoes. I don't really have I'm not Eliezer Yudkowsky's toenail, but I hear things like Bayesian updating, or like becoming a Bayesian agent, or mental models, the mental modeling view of the world and how we perceive our mental model rather than we actually perceive what's going on in reality.
Sure.
How much cohesion is there here? Does it sort of move away from the rationalist movement? Is the rationalist movement some of the things that you have come upon under different names?
Sure. Yep. So, I mean, there's one level at which the version of the Bayesian stuff that I'm interested in is called predictive processing models. And I'm actually working with two other people right now, Mark Miller and Brett Anderson, to try and integrate relevance realization theory with predictive processing, because we think they need each other. And so at the scientific level, that's work that's going on right now, and I hope it will be done this year and hopefully published this year. And I think this could be maybe the last sort of big thing I do in my career. I mean my academic career, because I'm getting old. But at the level at which it's taken into popular culture, I mean, you can't be Bayesian. So if you were to try to be Bayesian, and Gilbert Harman made this point a long time ago in the 80s in a book called Change in View. If you tried to be Bayesian, right, that's computationally intractable. You'd be combinatorially explosive. You can't do it. Okay? So what we see organisms doing is they're Bayesian with respect to what they find salient or relevant, which then just brings back the question about, okay, how do you do that? That's why you can really piss off a person from the predictive processing model. You ask them, but which model? What do you choose to model? And then they'll do a circular thing, that which turns out to be most adaptive, which is a teleological explanation. He says, yeah, but how do I build a machine that will do that? Right? I get that that's how it works, but how do I build a machine that would do that? How do I update the model? How do I bring insight into the model? How do I compare models of different scale? Right? And so there's all of that. And I suppose that points to the deeper issue, which is we have too overly simplistic a model of rationality, to my mind, because we have these different ways of knowing, and we have over limited the model of rationality to the logical, right, implication relations between propositions. We've limited rationality to inference management. Now, that's an important part of rationality, because changing your beliefs changes your behavior. But that is only a small sliver of what makes you a cognitive agent. Your procedural knowledge, your knowing how to do things, your skills, that's a big part. And there's ways in which you can be rational or irrational in that, because you can transfer a skill inappropriately, right? And we catch people doing that all the time. And it's like, no, that's not the right skill here, right? You can be perspectively, right, irrational. You can be totally logical with a completely fixated egocentrism. And if you don't know how to transform your perspectival knowing, you're going to suffer from a kind of self-deceptive behavior. Same thing with the participatory knowing. If you're not paying attention to the relationship between the agent-arena relationship, that can spiral downward into addiction, right? So we have to see that for all the kinds of knowing, there are perennial and profound patterns of self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. And so rationality is any kind of systematic and reliable and systemic set of practices for ameliorating our self-deceptive behavior. So it's not just the logical education of our inference machinery. It's also the education of our procedural abilities, our perspectival ability. So, for example, under my definition, mindfulness is a form of rationality, because mindfulness has to do with training attention, so you get better skills. That's procedural. So your perspectival knowing is more optimally and reliably functioning. And so we have many rationalities, and then we have sort of a meta-rationality of coordinating them together so that they optimally function together. So we have sort of a self-transcending rationality of rationalities. That's what I think wisdom is.
Can we go through your 4 types of knowing?
Sure.
And understand how, explain how the hierarchy of those fits together?
So the one we're most familiar with, as I said, is propositional knowing. This is the knowing that is the vehicle of it is belief, are propositions. So I know that cats are mammals, and I either believe it or I don't believe it. And then the normativity of that is truth or falsity. That's my sense of realness. And there's a form of memory that goes with that. It's called semantic memory. This is where you know that cats are mammals, right? But there's procedural knowing. This is knowing how to do something. This is knowing how to catch a ball. This is knowing how to ride a bike. This is knowing how to kiss somebody that you love, and knowing how to do it depending on what kind of love you have for them, right? And so that's not about beliefs. It's about skills. When you're done that, you don't have a theory. You have expertise, and it's not about true or falsity. It's about power. It's about how apt your skill is, how powerfully it can intervene. We have different senses of realness. Yes, we have the conviction of truth, but we also have the sense of power is another sense of realness. And of course, we have a different kind of memory that goes with that. And it's brilliantly in psychology called procedural memory, because it gives, right? And then we have perspectival knowing. This is knowing what it's like to be here now in this state of mind. I know what it's like for me to be me here now in a sober, reflective state of mind. This is what it's like. This is what my salience landscape is like so I know what it's like to be here now in this state of mind. And that gives me, it doesn't give me a theory, it doesn't even give me a skills. It gives me the situational awareness that tells me which skills I should apply or acquire. But that's dependent on me ultimately being, I didn't give you the sense of realness there. The sense of realness is, we know this from VR work, virtual reality. It's the sense of presence. It's the sense of being in the game, right? Like, I'm really present. And that's why we crave for that, because it's what gives us our sense of realness, right? And it's not the same thing as verisimilitude. You can get that sense of presence in a game like Tetris that has very little to do with how the world is really set up. It has more to do with, again, this optimal gripping thing I was talking about earlier. Below the perspectival, like if I'm going to have situational awareness, I have to be fitted to my environment. There have to be affordances. That's the level of the participatory knowing. That's the level at which evolutionary biology, cultural history, and the dynamics of my ongoing cognition are shaping my identity, shaping the identity of things so that they fit together in an adaptive manner. So what's most ancient and most fundamental ontologically is the participatory, because if you don't have that, the other ones can't work. And then once we get beings that plausibly have consciousness, you have perspectival and procedural, right? With us, we get this weird thing where I can make noises come out of my face hole and it creates thoughts in your mind. We get language and we have to justify statements, and we get justification systems, as Greg Enriquez says, around propositions. And we get really fixated on that as that's where we are, and that's where all knowing is, and that's where all reasoning is, and this, of course, this leads to something you mentioned earlier. You get the pseudo-religion of ideology. You get that what I need is a set of propositions, and I have to be really clear on what all those and what I believe and what my belief system is. And the problem with ideology and belief systems and people who want to understand everything just as political is, and this is precisely why it's pseudo-religious, is it ignores the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory. And if you pay attention to traditional religions until maybe the Protestant Reformation, they cared a lot more about those other P's than they did about the propositions, right? They cared much, much more about knowing how and knowing what it's like to be, and right? And so the participatory knowing, right, that gives you affordances, gives you a sense of belonging. When it goes wrong, you can fall into addiction. And like I said, that has its own kind of memory. Perspectival knowing has episodic memory. This is your ability to remember situations in like a scene. And participatory knowing has that weird sense of memory. We sometimes forget that it's a sense of memory. The sense of memory we call our sense of self, our sense of identity. And that also is in a different place in your brain, and right. So those are all the kinds of knowing, the relationships they have with each other, the normative standards they're judged by, their result, the vehicles that they operate in, and the different kinds of memory. And so, like, you have to think about all the different ways in which we're connecting to the world. And most of the meaning-making machinery is not at the propositional level. It's at the level of the other three.
Right now, in 2021, we're being championed for knowledge workers remote working from anywhere on the planet via Zoom.
Yeah.
The cerebral, scientific, rationalist, utilitarian revolution. Is this why we're being taken out of the embodied knowledge and up into the brain?
Well, we've been doing it. We've been doing it. I mean, for a very long time. When, for example, when Christianity became increasingly creedally oriented, and then that doesn't happen for like the first 4 centuries, in which the creed, and this is even paradoxical. Credo, I believe, originally meant like I give my heart to, believe in, I love it, rather than I believe it, right? But we've lost that. Now we think of belief as assertion, right? And then it gets really increased by the Protestant Reformation, Cartesian. So we've had a long history that's tutored us, the nominalism of the Middle Ages. Like I go into this series, but the scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformation, the movement towards written contract as the way in which we bind ourselves together in a society. We have increasingly seen propositions as the place in which we live. And I'll quote the Bible, and I don't mean to be sacrilegious, in which we live and move and have our being in these propositions. And I think you're right. I think the printed word and the textual word are really emphasizing that even more so. The problem, Zoom brings the possibility of a bit more of the perspectival, but it's limited, not too much of the procedural, except sort of conversational skills. I'm trying to work out a way in which we can bring in more of the perspectival, much more of the participatory. That's what I'm involved in this project, the Dialogos project, and really broaden the set of skills we should be bringing to this medium so that we can offer an alternative to left and right wing totalitarian approaches, and I don't mean totalitarian just in the governmental sense. I mean that propositional knowing, that kind of tyranny of the propositional way of knowing can be challenged.
I know that you're a fan of Tai Chi, and for a long time while I was a teenager, I practiced, I taught, I did a lot of Kung Fu for the same thing. And there was something there. First off, there's a fondness when I look back. Like, I really, really enjoy that memory. Every time I drive past the church that we did it in back home, it gives me a very unique sense that I don't think I've really got from much else. But there was a particular type of knowing in that, a sense that I don't really get. I don't get it from mindfulness. I don't get it from sitting. I don't get it from yoga. Actually, now I find that I don't get it from that either. But there was something to do with the sort of movements, the connection from body to brain.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, so I think what's really cool about Tai Chi Chuan is precisely because it goes into some of the nuts and bolts of the operating manual. So this is a story about me. I was in grad school, and I had sort of given up on academic philosophy as a place where you cultivate wisdom. I continued to do it because I liked the meta science and metacultural critique skills it was giving me, and then of course it fed into the cognitive science in a powerful way. But I'd taken up Tai Chi because I thought, well, there was actually a school nearby, and I could do Vipassana meditation, meta contemplation, and Tai Chi Chuan, and so that's where I'll go to cultivate wisdom. And I was doing it. And it was particularly the Tai Chi. And I remember my friends coming to me after I'd been doing it for a couple of years and saying, "What's going on with you?" And I thought, oh crap, because when you're in grad school, you're always worried that you've done something wrong, right? And I said, what do you mean? What do you mean? And they said, you're different. You think differently. You're more, and this is a wonderful way, wonderful evidence of acceptation. You're more balanced. You're more flexible, right, in your thinking. And I hadn't even realized it. I've just been doing it, like you said, like for you, I enjoyed it. But this transformation had been percolating up. And to me, and there's other evidence, but that's to give anecdotal evidence, right, that Tai Chi Chuan is designed to work at it starts out like at the sort of procedural level. You're learning skills, but it starts to get into the perspectival level. You realize the skills start to shift the way you're seeing things, right? And the language for this, the connection between the skills and the seeing is this language around chi. And then it gets even deeper. Translating it as energy is a really bad translation, right? And then it drops to the participatory level. You start to become a different agent, right, within a different arena. And I think when you can then do the thing that Tai Chi does in those three, when you can get into the flow state in something that's aligning and enhancing the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory in a way that seems to transfer out and be exacted out into multiple domains in your life, of course you would love that. Of course you would love that. In fact, isn't that precisely the kind of practice you should love?
It's difficult not to. And it makes me, every time that I think about it, it makes me sort of wistful. It's like a hunger. It's the same way I imagine a smoking craving must be for. I've never smoked, but I imagine it must be the same way that a craving for nicotine works.
That's that hunger we were talking about earlier. That's that lack. That's that hunger for connection. I call that religio, and because religio originally meant to bind together so that things belong together. But of course, it's one of the purported etymologies for the word religion, right? But it's that hunger. And something shaped it for you for a while, and it shaped it from just being a hunger into being a receptivity, a potential for connectivity. Sorry, I'm being presumptuous, but I'm trying to suggest to you that I think that's what the wistfulness is for, is that hunger was shaped into a receptivity that enhanced the religio, enhanced that connectedness that's at the foundation of our cognitive agency.
Let's say that there's some normal person like me who's listening who wants practices to cultivate their meaning on a daily basis. I know that you have, I wouldn't go as far as to call it a prescription, but perhaps some best practices of how you try and ensure that it happens in yourself. How can you instantiate this with daily work?
So you need, like I said, you need an ecology of practices. Because each practice has strengths and weaknesses, and you have to set them into complementary relationships with each other. So, for example, you should have a mindfulness practice that will shut off the inferential processing to enhance the insight processing. But you need active open-mindedness, which is the other practice that shuts off. It dampens down the insight machinery. You say, why would I want to dampen down the insight machinery? Remember what I said earlier? The thing that makes you adaptive also makes you subject to maladaptive. You know what makes you jump to conclusions inappropriately when you're thinking in an inferential fashion? It's that same insight machinery. So sometimes you need to shut off the inferential machinery because you need insight. But sometimes you need to dampen down the insight machinery so you run a more careful argument, careful inference. You don't jump to conclusions inappropriately. So you have to cultivate both mindfulness for the insight and active open-mindedness for the better inference. And then they have to constantly do opponent processing, push and pull on each other in a dynamically self-organizing fashion. You should definitely you need to take up a psychophysical practice like Tai Chi Chuan and yoga that will put you more readily into the flow state. That's quantitative, but qualitatively. So you flow more, but you also want to flow better. What do I mean by flow better? Learn how to flow in a way that is acceptable, transferable in an adaptive manner to many different domains in your life. You need to get a dialogical practice like we are doing right now, because we primarily learn how to transcend ourselves through internalizing other people's viewpoints on our viewpoint. That's how kids do it, and that's how adults continue to do it. And we need to bring back practices that have us not only communicating, like all of this wonderful technology, but communing, which right it's like we can together generate reciprocal religio, such that we get better at connecting to what is more real. We can bring flow into how we communicate with others, right? And so you need practices like that. You need practices drawn from Stoicism to help you overcome not just Stoicism. You need practices that help you understand, like I said earlier, the different kinds of maturity: cognitive maturity, emotional maturity, existential maturity. Find out ways in which you're stuck emotionally, stuck existentially, not just ways ways, of course, in which you're stuck cognitively. And so you need practices of what I call serious play. We used to have ritual. There's a reason why cultures across history and cultural contexts have ritual, because you have to engage in serious play in order to. That's why play is such a developmental necessity for all intelligent mammals, and especially for human beings. We have trivialized play. We have made it just entertainment, just for pleasure. We have forgotten, and that's what ritual used to be. And I don't mean like neurotic ritual. That's a misuse of the word ritual. That means a routine that you can't get out of, a compulsive routine. I'm talking about what we used to do, right? When we would engage in ritual. Tai Chi Chuan, properly practiced, is a ritual. It is a form of serious play in which you can taste and play with other identities, other perspectives, other ways of seeing and being, so you can make a more appropriate and, dare I say, rational choice of whether or not you want to undertake that aspirational journey towards that different self in a different world. People go to therapy because they don't know how to seriously play. Because that's what therapy is. People want to be, people know propositionally. I want to be over there. This is how I want to be. And they'll give you a great propositional description. And this is the world I want to be living in. And I can't get there. I don't know how. I don't know what it would feel like. I don't know how to be. Notice all the other P's that are missing. They know that, but they don't know how. They don't know what it would be like. They don't know how to be that kind of person. So they have to engage in this serious place so they can taste that and decide in that liminal space, am I going to commit to that? So you need practices of ritual, and what that looks like. I mean, maybe that's journaling for you. Maybe it's philosophical. Maybe it's a joint practice with other people. Like I've got some videos out there of philosophical fellowship. How do you get together, read a philosophical text, and then don't read it for information. Read it for communication and communing and trying to almost make present. It's almost like a secular seance. The perspective of the author of that text, so that you can come into a perspectival awareness of what it might taste like to be wiser than you are. There's all kinds of things that you can do. If you're interested in that, I mean, I did when COVID started, I did a live stream, and we recorded it all on, meditating with John Vervaeke, and then contemplative practices and some movement practices, and then wisdom practices drawn from the Epicurean tradition, the Stoic tradition, the Neoplatonic tradition. That's all there. That's all there for people who want to make use of it.
All on your YouTube channel?
Yep, all on my YouTube channel.
That will be linked in the show notes below, of course.
Yep, and there's also the whole Voices with Vervaeke series that I've been doing, where I'm trying to figure out, and I'm also, writing on it and writing articles and books on it with other people. But I'm trying to figure out, because what's emerging now are all these dialogical practices. People are trying to figure out, like Socrates, how do I get into authentic dialogue, what I call dialogos. And so Voices with Vervaeke is a bunch of instances of me trying to figure that out, exemplify it, talk about it, live it, reflect on it, explicate it, exemplify it. Again, like that's what that whole series is all about.
Speaking personally, and I think I'm probably a pretty good avatar for the people that are listening as well, it makes me feel almost a little bit uncomfortable how much I have put the cerebral, the rational, the utilitarian on a pedestal. And it's only, I shit you not, within the last year, half year, 6 months, that I've even started to put the word sacred back into my vocabulary.
Right.
And it's not just unless I'm even more of a freak than I thought. It's not just me. It's
not. It's not just you.
This profane. We had this example. Think about how many people still wear their shoes in their bedroom, the shoes that they've been outside in their bedroom. In which society would that be allowed?
Yeah.
And I know that it's kind of like a silly example, but it sort of explains what I mean. The transactional, transient nature of sex. You pick your example, and this is me speaking from as somebody who wants growth, who feels that growth in all directions is a good idea, and I can see in myself some huge lacks. LACKS. I feel like having been exposed to your work, it's reminded me and sort of opened my eyes to just how much work there is for me to do. Upon doing a podcast where you speak to people for, there's nearly 1,000 hours of me talking on the internet available now. So I've spent an awful lot of time developing up here, but it's been at the cost of various other types of knowing, various other types of practice as well. The practices that I've been drawn to, and maybe a lot of the people that are listening to, have been ones that have facilitated my cognition. They've been ones that have allowed me to perform better within the arena of play of cognition.
Yes. Yeah. You and me, brother, both, right? My besetting sin is I tend to bring in my capacities for rational argumentation and scientific theorizing into places where they do not properly belong. That is one of the things that I have to pay very careful attention to. It's one of the proclivities for self-deception and the mistreatment of others that I have to pay a lot of attention to. So I totally get what you're saying. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just sharing. And so I think, and I mean, I'm doing scientific work on this with people like Jennifer Steller and Michelle Ferrari and Jensen Kim and Brian Ostafin on awe. We're like awe. And so remember how insight is like opening up to a frame? Well, and this is the difference between curiosity and wonder. Curiosity is when you're trying to fill a hole in your knowledge. Wonder is when you're willing to call your world and yourself more into question. That's why Socrates said wisdom begins in wonder. And then if you push it a little bit farther, you get awe. And there's a reason why we like awe, because that is where we are really opening ourselves up to this non-propositional transformation that we've been talking about. But see, awe is an experience. And experiences have to be cultivated by a virtue. And we have lost the virtue that gets us to appropriately grip the awe experience.
What do you mean?
Well, so, all right. So let's just get a quick Aristotelian thing about, right? I'm trying to cultivate my character. And so there are things in my environment that are fearful. And but my response can be wrong in excess or deficit. I can be overwhelmed too easily by my fear and I become a coward. But I can then not pay enough attention to the reality of fear, what fear is trying to get me to see, and then I become a fool and I become an impulsive, risk-taking idiot, right? And I harm not only myself but others. And so what I do is I create these sort of, like, again, this opponent processing. I create habits that make me confront fear more, sort of open up the variation. You can hear the evolutionary language here. And then I create counter habits that pare it down and put selective pressure on it. And by doing that, I sort of steer between these two until I get better and better at getting an optimal grip on how fear is relating me to the environment. Is that okay? Did that make sense?
Yep.
So think of awe, and if you push awe too far, it starts to create a kind of fear, horror. So think of awe like that. You're opening yourself up. There's a sense of exposure. The sense of self gets small, right? So how do you properly steer awe so that, right, you don't You don't overwhelm people or get them blown away or get them hardened or traumatized. Or on the other hand, how do you coax them out of their comfort zone so they just want to stay home and never leave home like Luke Skywalker, right? Do you have to blow their home apart in order to do that, right? So Woodruff talks about this. He talks about the virtue by which we appropriately relate to what awe is showing us about the environment. And he calls that virtue reverence. See, reverence is relevance, right? So when you look at the things that create meaning in life, many people think it's a sense of purpose. A sense of purpose is one of the things, but it's not the most important thing. That's kind of like, that's a little bit too market oriented, right? The other things that make you feel connected, religio, have that sense of meaning in life, are a sense of intelligibility. Like, this has to make sense. I have to be zeroing in on the relevant things in the relevant way, right? Significance or depth. It has to be real. It has to be real. I have to be able to discern the real patterns from the illusory patterns. But you know what really makes a difference to meaning in life? It's mattering. It's what Susan Wolf talks about, that sense of being connected to something larger than yourself, something that has a value and a reality beyond your egocentric perspective. Reverence is the sense of mattering. It's the sense of being connected to something, not because of how it is important to your egocentrism, but of how you are important to it, about how you are plugged into something bigger than yourself that is going on. And I think reverence is what helps tutor awe into a sense of the sacred.
A lot of the words that you use in your work have been things that I've come upon over the last year, and awe is certainly one of them. Whenever I hear the word awe, I always think about the night sky. You know, big, yes, open expanse, yeah, making you feel small and insignificant, and framing your problems and your finite capacity framed with infinite complexity that you can see above.
Yes, beautifully said. Beautifully said.
I had this tweet a while ago saying, you are a finite creature surrounded by infinite complexity. Of course, you're going to be scared.
Yes. Yes. But what awe says is, again, you can shape that lack. You can shape that fear into a receptivity, because it also means that you're a creature that can, as Schlegel put it, we are finite beings longing for the infinite, right? So you can shape that exposure, that hole, that vulnerability. It's not easy. I'm not claiming to be a master of it by any means, but I have some sense of this, that you can shape that so that, yeah, the fear is more awe, and it's more of a sense of how the infinite affords you, it affords you the escape from the prison walls of your own ego. And that sometimes when our ego is being diminished, that's death. But sometimes when our ego is being diminished, that's overcoming the prison of our egocentrism. I mean, when we moved from transient sex to the really difficult commitment to being in love with somebody and really reciprocally opening with them, because it's hard and it hurts, right? Like it's hard and it hurts again and again, right? And if you're just in egocentric mode, you'll just become afraid of that, and then you close up and you just have the transient sex. But if you're capable of, if those little holes of grief become apertures through which you see beyond yourself, and for a moment you have some awe about, wow, that person really does transcend my grasp of them. That's what keeps you going, and that's what takes you into the depths of yourself and other people and reality. And then again, what else do you want?
I don't know. I really do think that the common thread between a lot of your work is a lot of things that I've been thinking about recently, and I think that's one of the reasons that it does have a sense of dread, is perhaps to significance in the same way as when you stand on the edge of a cliff and you look down.
Yeah.
That's the sort of sense that I get, and I hope that a lot of the audience will be being introduced to you for the first time. Some not, but a lot certainly for the first time. You have been talking about. I want to bring up after Socrates in a moment.
Yeah.
One of the allegories, the Plato's allegory of the cave, which I was taught about only again within the last year by a friend called Jordan. You know, I'd heard it before, but I didn't understand its significance. For people who are seeking whatever we want to call it, truth, wisdom, actualization, transcendence, growth, whatever term it is that you want to give yourself, you are inevitably going to put yourself out on a limb, and you are a participatory being. You are someone who wants to be wanted, liked, accepted for being a part of the group. But inevitably, you've changed. Now, your friends, thankfully, said you're balanced. You seem more balanced. But equally, people can be very, very unhappy at seeing friends change and grow because it often highlights their lack of change and their lack of growth. What would you say to people who have a desire to make change in their life but don't necessarily have that support, that community, and they've got that fear of the being ostracized for doing it?
First of all, I want to express deep compassion because that has, you said I studied what I lacked. And so, yes. When you undertake this, and again, this isn't like a slot machine. Put the thing in and pull the lever or something like that. But when you undertake this kind of journey, you will lose relationships. I don't want to mince that at all. I have a marriage, right? And that's not to make myself heroic. I also did shitty things that caused the demise. Okay, I don't want to avoid responsibility, but it's fair to say that was also a factor. I can say that, I think, honestly, and I think the person who was involved would say that honestly too. You can, and that's a difficult thing we sometimes face in our relationships when we realize that there's a significant differential in our growth arcs, and that can be extremely. And I think that's not recognized enough as a problem in our relationships. And the problem is because of the decadent romanticism in our culture, we basically try to turn our romantic relationships into a religion. And so we put tremendous pressure on them. They really can't bear it. They really can't bear it. And we should stop doing that. We need other things. And I'm guilty of that too. I'm guilty of that too. I do it. I've done it recently, and it's been problematic. And I have to take a step back and go, "Oh crap, I'm doing that." I speak about this, and here I am doing it, right? And so all of this stuff is going to, you're going to lose relationships. But what seems to be the case is you will gain and I'm playing on this word. I want it to mean both meanings. You will gain virtuosity, and that virtuosity will allow you to discern, but also attract to you the kind of people who are also seeking virtuosity. And so different kinds of relationships will become available to you. And it takes, and I'm sorry, it takes longer than the lifetime of a movie. That's the problem with movies. We feel wonderful because it only takes 2 hours for things to be resolved, and this can be years in the making. But you will also find friendship where you might not have found it before. You might befriend your body and your mind in a way you haven't before. I have a wooden sword I do Tai Chi with, and I have befriended that. I have learned how to more deeply befriend Socrates and Spinoza. So some of the friendships will be ones that might not be sort of with living people, but they'll nevertheless be living relationships for you. And that is not paradoxical or self-contradictory. And then hopefully, again, this is not deterministic, but it does increase the probability that you will more likely come into the kind of relationship that is supportive of you cultivating wisdom. I think that's one of the defining differences between buddies and friends. We call a lot of people our friends, but they're not. They're our buddies. A buddy is somebody you enjoy doing something with, and you should have buddies. That's good. That's why we have this term. A friend is somebody that is committed to you becoming wiser, and you are committed to them becoming wiser. And that's a different thing entirely. And you will increase your chance of real friendship. So you might find, I can't promise you that there isn't an algorithm here, a magical formula, but I have found, and I've seen it in others, that you get a trade-off. The quantity of relationships diminishes, whereas the quality of them improves. And so some of it takes you, actually, instead of finding a community, sometimes you have to make it also. So it can be lonely and it can be alienating, but it can also, if pursued with a genuine love, it can be liberating. It can liberate you and put you into real relationships with real patterns and real people in real ways. So that's what I have to say about that.
What do you think that 80-year-old you would tell current you?
What would 80-year-old John tell? Try to focus more on the love you find in your relationship. And I hope you mean, no, I don't mean just romantic love. I'm not excluding that, but I don't mean just romantic love. Try to focus more on the love you find in your relationships than the fear that you find in your relationships.
That's a wonderful way to finish. Talking about what's happening next for you, I know that terrifyingly discussing the potential precipice at the end of your academic career, which might come to fruition, but hopefully you'll be sort of tempted to stay. On the audience side, what can we expect from you over the remainder of 2021?
So I'm going to start filming tonight with Greg Enriquez, Chris Mastropietro, The Elusive I, capital I, The Elusive I, the nature and function of the self, trying to do sort of the best cognitive science on what is this thing we call the self, how does it work, and how does it function, what is it, how does it function. And then hopefully when COVID will allow me, probably a 20 to 30 part series called After Socrates, where I'm going to go back to the Socratic practices of authentic dialogos, see how it worked, what was dialectic, how did it bring us into the flow state of dialogos, do that historical analysis, and then do a structural scientific analysis and participant observation, because I've already been doing it, of all these emerging authentic discourse communities, circling practices and the empathy circling and, insight dialogue and inquiry. There is no coincidence that we have this proliferation of practices that are designed to reintegrate communication and communion and transformation together. And so I want to do the best historical analysis of the Socratic heritage, follow it all the way through, all the people that came after Socrates. And so Socrates and the Stoics and the Epicureans and the Neoplatonists and the existentialists, right? All of that. So that's one sense of after, but also people who are taking after Socrates right now, who are trying to create, right? Steal the culture bottom up by creating new ways of entering into dialogos. And then, if you'll allow me the pun, put those two into dialogue with each other, the history and the analysis. And we've, already published a book seeking publication on a book on this right now called Inner and Outer Dialogues, where we have Chris Mastropietro and I were editing. We've got all the people on this, not all of them, but a lot of the people in this community, the people who are both practicing it and theorizing about it and trying to put the two together. That's hopefully coming out this year. After Socrates is going to be coming out this year. There'll still be more voices with Vervaeke. There'll be like I said, the elusive I. And then after Socrates is done, I want to start working on. I sort of always had a trilogy in mind. The third series, the third sort of big scope series is called the God beyond God, and the inventio of the sacred. Because the Latin word inventio means to discover and to make. It means both of them together. And so those are the things that John Vervaeke is going to be working on.
Where should people go if they want to be kept up to date with what's happening?
They can follow me on Twitter. They can subscribe on YouTube channel. I'm also on LinkedIn. I don't use it, but through Hootsuite I sort of post on Facebook. So there's a bunch of places, but especially on Twitter and YouTube. That's where you could most readily get the information. I do a monthly live streamed Q&A on my YouTube channel. The next one is actually this Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, if people want to come on and ask questions.
Awesome. All of that will be linked in the show notes below. John, thank you. I really, really love your work. I'm very, very glad that I found it. And yeah, I'm looking forward to being terrified and satisfied in equal measure, hopefully, as I continue to dig deeper into it.
Well, thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed this. It was great. And if you ever want to talk again, I'd be open to it.
Yeah, yeah.